Morning, everybody. Welcome to Tawa School's story time for the 31st of March. Today's the last, continuing with the Twits by Roald Dahl. So first up, here's Super Rabbit. There was once a little rabbit who thought he was Super Rabbit. When his mother said, "Time to get up, my little rabbit," he replied, "Kapow! I'm Super Rabbit." "Not all that super," said the cat. When his mother asked him, "What are you going to do today, my little rabbit?" he replied, "May I remind you, mother, I'm not a little rabbit. I'm Super Rabbit. And super rabbits fight supervillains." So off went Super Rabbit to find some villains. By and by, he came upon a hollow tree. Inside it, all was still. Super Rabbit, who was afraid of nothing, jumped into the hollow. It was very cold. "Mummy! Mummy!" yelled the little rabbit. "There's a piece of sword in my finger." His mother went looking for something to remove the piece of sword. As you can guess, it was probably a splinter. "How did this happen, my little rabbit?" she asked. "A villain attacked me with a sword. The little rabbit felt something new. He felt fear and pain, and he did not like it. The little rabbit's mother pulled out the splinter. "You're the bravest little rabbit in the world," she said. "You're not afraid of anything." And the little rabbit yelled, "Of course I'm not afraid. I'm Super Rabbit." "But where are you going with the splinter, my little rabbit?" asked Mother. "It's not a splinter, Mother. It's a super sword. And I'm off to fight supervillains because I'm Super Rabbit." Love that story. That's really cool. All right, we're going to continue on with Roald Dahl's The Twits. We're up to the chapter called The Frog. Remember last time, there was the whole trick with the glass eye. So today, we're going to find out about the frog. There may be some other tricks too. To pay her back for the glass eye and his bear, Mr. Twit decided he would put a frog in Mrs. Twit's bed. He caught a big one down by the pond and carried it back secretly in a box. That night, when Mrs. Twit was in the bathroom getting ready for bed, Mr. Twit slipped the frog between her sheets. Then he got into his own bed and waited for the fun to begin. Mrs. Twit came back and climbed into her bed and put out the light. She lay there in the dark, scratching her tummy. Her tummy was itching. Dirty old hags like her always have itchy tummies. Then all at once, she felt something cold and slimy crawling over her feet. She screamed. "What's the matter with you?" Mr. Twit said. "Help!" screamed Mrs. Twit, bouncing. "There's something in my bed." "I'll bet it's a giant skillywhigger I saw on the floor just now," Mr. Twit said. "That what?" screamed Mrs. Twit. "I tried to kill it, but it got away," Mr. Twit said. "It's got teeth like screwdrivers." "Help!" screamed Mrs. Twit. "Save me! It's all over my feet!" "Bite off your toes," said Mr. Twit. Mrs. Twit fainted. Mr. Twit got out of bed and fetched a jug of cold water. He poured the water over Mrs. Twit's head to revive her. The frog crawled up from under the sheets to get near the water. It started jumping about on the pillow. Frogs love water. This one was having a good time. When Mrs. Twit came to, the frog had just jumped on her face. This was not a nice thing to happen to anyone in bed at night, and she screamed again. By golly, it is a giant skilly wiggler, Mr. Twit said. It'll bite off your nose. Mrs. Twit leapt out of bed, flew downstairs, and spent the night on the sofa. The frog went to sleep on her pillow. The next chapter, the wormy spaghetti. The next day, to pay Mr. Twit back for the frog trick, Mrs. Twit sneaked out into the garden and dug up some worms. She chose big, long ones and put them in a tin and carried the tin back to the house under her apron. At 1 o'clock, she cooked spaghetti for lunch and she mixed the worms in with the spaghetti, but only on her husband's plate. The worms didn't show because everything was covered with tomato sauce and sprinkled with cheese. "Oi, my spaghetti's moving!" cried Mr. Twit, poking around in it with his fork. "It's a new kind," Mrs. Twit said, taking a mouthful from her own plate. Of course, hers had no worms. "It's called squiggly spaghetti. It's delicious. Eat it up while it's nice and hot." Mr. Twit started eating, twisting the long tomato-covered strings with his fork and shoveling them into his mouth. Soon there was tomato sauce all over his hairy chin. "It's not as good as the ordinary kind," he said, talking with his mouth full. "It's too squishy," eating worms. "I find it rather bitter," Mr. Twit said. "It's got a distinctly bitter flavour. Buy the other kind next time." Gross. Mrs. Twit waited until Mr. Twit had eaten the whole plateful. Then she said, "You want to know why your spaghettis was squishy?" Mr. Twit wiped the tomato sauce from his beard with a corner of the tablecloth. "Why?" he said. "And why it has a nasty bitter taste?" "Why?" he said. "Because it was worms!" cried Mrs. Twit, clapping her hands and stamping her feet on the floor and rocking with horrible laughter. We'll read one more chapter, the funny walking stick. To pay Mrs. Twit back for the worms in his spaghetti, Mr. Twit thought up a really clever nasty trick. One night, when the old woman was asleep, he crept out of bed and took her walking stick downstairs to the workshed. There, he stuck a tiny round piece of wood, no thicker than a penny, onto the bottom of the stick. This made the stick longer, but the difference was so small. The next morning, Mrs. Twit didn't even notice it. The following night, Mr. Twit stuck on another tiny bit of wood. Every night he crept downstairs and added an extra tiny thickness of wood to the end of the walking stick. He did it very neatly so that the extra bits looked like part of the old stick. Now, when something is growing very slowly, it is almost impossible to notice it happening. You yourself, for example, are actually growing taller every day that goes by, but you wouldn't think it, would you? It's happening so slowly you can't even notice it from one week to the next. It was the same with Mrs. Twit's walking stick. It was all so slow and gradual that she didn't notice how long it was getting, even when it was halfway up to her shoulder. "That stick's too long for you," Mr. Twit said to her one day. "Why, so it is," Mrs. Twit said, looking at the stick. "I had a feeling there was something wrong, but I couldn't for the life of me think what it was." "There's something wrong, all right," Mr. Twit said, beginning to enjoy himself. "What can have happened?" Mrs. Twit said, staring at her old walking stick. "It must suddenly have grown longer." "Don't be a fool," Mr. Twit said. "How can a walking stick possibly grow longer? It's made of dead wood, isn't it? Dead wood can't grow." "Then what on earth has happened?" cried Mrs. Twit. "It's not the stick, it's you," Mr. Twit said, grinning horribly. "It's you that's getting shorter. I've been noticing it for some time now." "That's not true," cried Mrs. Twit. "You're shrinking, woman," said Mr. Twit. "It's not possible." "Oh, yes, it jolly well is," said Mr. Twit. "You're shrinking fast. You're shrinking dangerously fast. Why, you must have shrunk at least a foot in the last few days." "Never," she cried. "Of course you have. Take a look at your stick, you old goat, and see how much you've shrunk in comparison." "You've got the shrinks. That's what you've got. You've got the dreaded shrinks." Mrs. Twit began to feel so trembly, she had to sit down. We're going to continue on next week. Mrs. Twit has the shriek. So I have a feeling that with all this nastiness and everything, I think some people are going to start to fight back with all this nastiness and try and bring some goodness into the world. Hey guys, I hope you're having a great day today and look after yourselves. Remember, be kind, keep your distance, and look after one another. And we'll catch you same time tomorrow. Ka kite anō.